Good morning, and thank you for joining the WEIM Governance Review Committee Stakeholder Meeting. Please note that all audio connections are currently muted. If you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, click on the raise hand icon in the toolbar. If you do not see the toolbar, please move your cursor and the toolbar will appear. If you are on a mobile device, tap your screen to display the toolbar. With that, I'll turn the call over to Burton Gross, Deputy General Counsel. Please go ahead.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining at this early hour. I'm going to just handle a few administrative matters to start the meeting, and then I'll turn over for the substance of the meeting to Chair Hampton. The first topic is to actually take roll call, so I'll just read through the committee members' names and ask for you to say whether you're present or I guess not. Michelle Beck.
Present.
Tony Braun.
Present.
Suzanne Cooper. I'll come back just to check later, but moving on, Eric Eisenman.
Here.
Therese Hampton. Teresa, I see
Here.
you, but you're not, I can't hear you. Okay.
Yeah, there was a delay in
Okay.
the unmute. I'm here.
Sure. Amanda Ormond. Okay. Appears Amanda is not here unless she's on mute. I'll move along. Pam Sporborg.
Here.
Lisa Tawney.
I'm here.
Lisa, okay. Rob Taylor.
I'm here.
Rebecca Wagner.
Here.
Cameron Yurkowski.
I'm here.
Hello. And then the two non-voting members, Angelina Galiteva
Here.
and John Prescott.
I'm here.
Great. We have a quorum, so we can move forward with the agenda. The next item on the agenda is to provide an opportunity for any public comments from members of the public on any issues that are not on the agenda. So if there's matters that are on the agenda, you'll have an opportunity to speak to those at a later point in time. But as we typically do, we do offer at least an opportunity for public comment on non-agenda items. So if the operator could please check the lines and give instructions for people if they want to make a public comment.
If you would like to make a public comment, you can select the raise hand icon in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. You'll hear a notification when you are unmuted, at which point please state your name, the company you represent, and your question. If you are audio only, please dial #2 on your telephone keypad.
Operator, are there any no raised hands? Okay. All right. Well, then move it. I'm sorry.
Not at this time.
Okay. Thank you. Moving on, the next item is to approve the April 29th, 2022 general session minutes of the GRC. Unless any members have any questions about the substance of those minutes, what I would ask for one of the voting members to move to vote on the minutes, and then a second from another voting member. Do I have a motion?
This is Michelle. I'll make the motion.
Okay.
This is Tony. I'll
Is there a
second. Second.
Okay. Thank you. And now I'll just go through the voting members again, not including the absent voting members. So Michelle Beck.
Aye.
Tony Braun.
Aye.
Eric Eisenman.
Aye.
Therese Hampton.
Aye.
Pam Sporborg.
Aye.
Lisa Tawney. Lisa, are you perhaps on mute?
Aye.
Thank you. Rob Taylor.
Aye.
Rebecca Wagner,
Aye.
and Cameron Yurkowski.
Aye.
Great, thank you very much. The minutes have been approved, and I'll turn it back to you, Therese, for the bulk of the meeting.
Terrific. Thanks, Bert. Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning on a day that I know already has lots of other meetings. We appreciate you taking the time this morning. What we are happy to share with you today is an overview of the straw proposal that was released last Friday. You can find both this presentation, the straw proposal, on the CAISO website under the initiative Phase 3. We are in Phase 3. And so today, myself and a number of the GRC members are going to go through some of the high points of the straw proposal. This is not an exhaustive review of the straw proposal, so we invite you to go ahead and read it and look through it. It's intended to be written in a very accessible fashion to lay out both our logic and reasoning in the straw proposal, and we are looking forward to your comments. If we can go to the next slide, I'll cut to the chase a little bit. The comment period is, and we can go to the next slide, the comment period is open through August 15th. So this is the beginning of a comment process. We invite you, this is a list of the GRC members. We invite you to contact us at any point during the comment process to ask questions, clarification, anything. If you want us to give a briefing about what it is and what it says, we are happy to do that. That's kind of our goal and objective as part of this process. This is the list of Governance Review Committee members. We show it at the beginning of every meeting. We will just note we do not have Andy Campbell any longer as a GRC member, because we are now happy to know that he is an EIM governing body member replacing Val Fong. So we are one shy at this point of what we previously were, but very happy that he continues in this process. If we go to the next slide, just a little bit of background about what brought us and how the process that we've used to get to this point. Back in February, we started with questions for all of you about what should be within scope of the work that we do. We had a general session meeting. We took comments from all of you. Then in March, we were briefed by the EDAM market design participants. Actually, there were leads from each of the different key areas of the EDAM market design that reached us to kind of give us a sense for what we should look at in terms of the scope of the market design and how that might impact governance. In April, we had a general session meeting where we talked about what we thought, based on your comments, should be within scope and some options that we were looking at, and then had a number of public meetings at the body of state regulators, the Regional Issues Forum, and then a lot of informal stakeholder outreach by our sectors with each of the different GRC members, and had a stakeholder panel discussion on governance options at the EDAM market design meeting in May, which was very helpful to the GRC in putting kind of this straw proposal together. There was a good, diverse representation of stakeholders in terms, and they talked about many of the different issues that are in this straw proposal. So here we are today. We continued stakeholder outreach to develop this straw proposal, and it was published on Friday. Again, it's on the website, and we're going to talk about it here today, and then we're available to you for the whole rest of the comment period. We go to the next slide. These are the principles to guide the GRC. This is not a comprehensive list of principles, but if we went back to the very beginning of the GRC's process back in Phase 1, we thought it was important to put principles together to guide how we looked at different options. And the overarching principle that's listed here hasn't changed from the beginning. We have made a couple of wording changes to add in the EDAM market and that concept, but the overarching principle remains that our goal is to ensure that the governance of the EIM and the EDAM market would provide stakeholders with confidence that it is a governance structure that represents the market as a whole and respects and considers the interests of all stakeholders, and that it would be resilient under changes. So thinking about it as the market could change, different issues would come up. What's listed on this slide was something that we did share at the April 29th general session as well, but just wanted to emphasize here, we have put it in this document It is a recommendation of 3 additional principles that we have added for this governance review. And specifically, it is to modify or enhance governance structure as it relates to the establishment of EDAM in support of an autonomous governing body. We hear that consistently. That's what there is an interest is to have an autonomous governing body. The second added existing principle, which has a letter G to it, because we've actually put numbers to them in the document. You'll see that. So this is just we didn't misnumber this. FGH is how it appears from the document. But the second is to assure that the modifications balance the interests of the different market participants, recognize the interests of the full ISO market participants in the ISO balancing authority are different than the prospective EDAM participants. And so to really hear and understand those and to balance those. And then lastly, we wanted to ensure that the modifications and enhancements to the governance support or advance a potential future governance structure appropriate for a multi-state RTO. That's not our charge here. We understand that. However, it has became very apparent to us from stakeholder comments that there is an interest in ensuring that we don't put barriers in the way of that, or that we're thinking about that as we put governance proposals forward. So those are the 3 new principles. They are in the document. You're free to comment on them. We had them, like I said, at the April 29th meeting and have talked to stakeholders about that over the period of time. And I think we've heard general support for those principles, but that is in the document for you to look at and comment on. So now we're going to transition. If we go to the next slide, we're going to transition to a couple of key sections in the document. And this is where I'm going to turn it over and you're going to hear from several different GRC members. We're going to talk about delegation of authority and start with Commissioner Lisa Taney.
Great. Can you hear me, Therese? Wonderful. All right. Well, thanks so much. And let's go on to the next slide. Thanks. So the GRC spent really a significant amount of time as a stakeholder group discussing the pros and cons of the primary authority model that was the governance approach prior to the governance review process that completed last year, and the joint authority model that we moved to over the winter, that the GRC had proposed for EIM and we moved to over the winter. And I have to say, personally, it was really remarkable to see parties that had really significant reservations about joint authority last year, given the substantially expanded scope of that authority, really wholeheartedly supporting joint authority, the joint authority model this time around. I think it's early days, but folks are having a positive experience with it. The primary authority advocates really laid out clear arguments and pros and cons in their comments, and we spent a lot of time unpacking those, understanding them, discussing them. And they argue that it's essential for the board, which represents a full breadth of the market, all of the BAs, to make the regional decisions with autonomy. And as you just heard from Therese, the GRC is prioritizing autonomy of West-wide decision-making from the California political process. But as we grappled with the reality of the constraints of the construct of corporate governance, the CAISO board will always hold some sort of veto or remand in our current structure, right? This is not about what might happen in the future, but where we are today. And that made the autonomy from the primary authority model feel very limited. I think there was a sense that it sets up the potential for 2 different boards to be making decisions from 2 different sets of inputs that have some overlap, but not perfect overlap, from sets of stakeholders that have some overlap, but not perfect overlap, and really creating a situation where there's poor understanding of how their choices are reverberating across the market footprint. and that dissonance is risky as we all grapple with the implications of the changes in the generation stack and how the grid is operating and the pressure of heat and so on that are happening across the grid. And so as a result, the GRC is recommending continuing to lean into the joint authority model, which seems to, within the constraints that exist today, enable a really productive problem-solving posture to emphasize the degree to which we're all interdependent and impact each other, and to really start practicing building the muscles of the CAISO weighing regional impacts of policy choices, really thinking about regional governance. We preserve the autonomy of the governing body by having their vote go first. They can't be overridden by the CAISO board outside of the pretty extensive dispute resolution process that we instituted last year, and that already exists, and that's described in the paper in much more detail to refresh you since we haven't had to go through it, thank heavens. And they also retain their own market expertise still, and in the dispute resolution can retain their outside counsel. So we felt that preserved their autonomy while meeting, really leaning into Principle H and Principle G, balancing those interests and enabling continued growth as a regional entity within the constraints that we have today. So with that sort of summary of the recommendation, can we go to the next slide? And you'll see this graphic in the paper, and this is an effort to summarize both how joint authority is working today in the EIM and how we would envision that it would work in EDAM. So you have your market design issues that have been teed up through a variety of processes. And there's some discussion later in the document about that process. And you have stakeholder input coming into the discussion directly through the BOSSR, through the Regional Issues Forum. And you have additional information coming into the process through the Independent Market Expert, the Department of Market Monitoring, and the Market Surveillance Committee. And I want to highlight one of the changes that we made last year, that the CAISO Governing Board of Governors made last year, was to invite a governing body member to attend the DMM Oversight Committee meetings in a non-voting role, but to invite them into that conversation. And the governing body also has joint authority with the board over approving MSC members. And so the two boards work together in a joint manner, not just over the issues, but in that engagement in the stakeholder and data input, information gathering, fact set building process. Decisions come to both boards. They both have to approve. And if they both approve, then the tariff changes go forward. And if they don't, then we move into the dispute resolution cycle, which really focuses primarily on working the decision through again and again to see if agreement can be reached, and really taking that posture of joint problem solving. And so that's the recommendation. It's what we've adopted under the EIM today, and what we think sets us on a productive path forward in the day ahead market as it comes to fruition. Of course, that implicates then what is the scope of authority. And so we can go to the next slide for the next presenter around the scope. I'm forgetting who that is.
Great, thanks, Letha. We're going to start with Rebecca to present this piece, and she may be supported by Tony Braun.
Thanks, Therese. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to cover what we, as the GRC, have contemplated as an expansion of the scope to accommodate EDAM. On this slide, you see a blue lined rather than a red line version of what's in the charter, or what could be in the charter that addresses the applies to test. This would be modified, expanded to add EDAM to the applies to test. So essentially, this is broadening the scope of the governing body as much as possible, but for the pieces that are very specific to the ISO balancing authority area or the ISO controlled grid. And it also lays out where advisory authority would come into play. Next slide. And as we were evaluating the apply to test, we considered a lot of different options to really try to capture a lot of the concerns that we were hearing from stakeholders about things that are outside of EIM and EDAM that don't fit neatly in there, but nonetheless affect entities as they participate in the ISO market. So we are trying to evaluate, and we've come up with a couple of options here. And this is where we're seeking some very specific feedback on how to address those other impactful issues, but still have some semblance of durability, that it isn't this squishy, fuzzy line back and forth. So what we're seeking input on is developing, there's two options that we're considering. One, develop a set of specific issues or topics that would fall under the apply to test that we can identify readily. Or the other option is the flip side of that is to extend the joint authority to all real-time and day-ahead market rules, and then create a defined set of exceptions or exclusions for the topics. Either way, both there's pros and cons either way. In the straw proposal, there lists some examples of what would be covered. I'm not going to go read that to you, but it's on page 14 of the straw proposal, 14, 15, that area of areas where we tried to identify some specific things that might fall in under this impactful issue area. And we do seek specific proposals. So we don't want to, yeah, that sounds like a good idea, or no, that's not a good idea. We're seeking some very specific dig in to the tariff and look at those and provide proposals on the rules or concepts for additions or exclusions, whichever option, that will help make this a durable classification process as new issues arise, but also clear enough to know where things are going to fall out as they come up. I'm going to turn to Tony, who is far more expert on this topic than I, to fill in where I may have left some gaps.
Thanks, Rebecca. I'm not sure I would agree with that characterization, but I would only add that we have to take into account the character of the EDAM proposal. Excuse me. And, you know, admittedly, it's a halfway house between what we have now and a full RTO. And so that helps shape, I think, some of the concepts and suggestions and proposals here. I also think we're a little bit creating a dilemma that largely didn't exist. I think everyone expected that there were specific things that, like transmission planning, generator interconnection, resource adequacy, I believe, which were never contemplated to be part of the joint authority. And then when you go back and you look at the applied to test, it really is a very broad set of the remaining tariff provisions. And so I think when the next level of digging here revealed that there was other formulations of potential tests that seemed broader, but in application, the applied to test was very broad. So Rebecca indicated that we are really looking to get specific ideas, specific tariff sections, substantive issues, and proposals here to see whether we should, how this should be refined, or if it should be refined. A final characteristic that I'd like the stakeholders to think about is symmetry. This is an EDAM market. It's not an RTO. The EDAM entities retain significant functions in their own right, and the EIM and EDAM governance doesn't affect those. So think about, I'd like the stakeholders as they're contemplating this to think about whether we're creating symmetrical rules here for the new market. So that's all I have to add. I really appreciate, we really hope to get good concrete feedback on this issue.
Thanks, Tony. You added in some nuances that I think are really important, especially the piece about symmetry. We'll go to the next slide. And just to wrap up our section of this, we don't have any proposed changes to the dispute resolution or decisional classification. This infographic just describes the process and demonstrates visually how the dispute resolution works or could work. I don't know how far we've had to test any of this so far, but this depicts that, but we're not making any changes, just throwing it in to remind you of how the process is working now. With that, I will turn it back to Therese.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca and Tony. I'm going to stop here and just see, this is a really important part of the straw proposal. And so, operator, if you want to open the line for questions or clarification, if anybody has questions that they have, now would be a good time on both the type of delegation of authority and the scope of delegation of authority.
All right, just a quick reminder that if you would like to ask a question or make a comment, you can use the raise hand icon in WebEx. You'll receive a notification when your line is unmuted. You'll have to click saying, please unmute, and then you'll be able to state your name, the company you work for, and your question. If you are audio only, you can dial #2. We do have some hand raised in the queue. Caller, your line is unmuted.
Hi, yeah, this is Elaine Ginocchio. I just had a question about what you were just talking about on slide 10. Could you mentioned, and this is for Rebecca, Tony, or anybody who wants to answer it. You said that, you know, there were pros and cons of those two options that you wanted us to comment on. Could you talk a little bit about the pros and cons that came up in your GRC discussions?
And operator, can you go back to slide 10 for a moment? Just so there we go. Thank you. So the question, Elaine, is and I'm gonna do a quick summary. So what the GRC has recommended is this apply to test be extended to EDAM. But what we've heard from stakeholders is there might still be issues that impact them that are not encompassed in the apply to test. So we had two options that we'd like to explore. Are there things that we might want to add to the apply to test? That's option A. Or alternatively B, we can take a broader kind of base of the scope of authority and say it's all real-time and day-ahead market rules except for certain things, right? So it's either this addition to the apply to test or the exception to a broader scope. And Elaine, your question is, what were the pros and cons that we talked about between that A and B option?
Yeah, and maybe not, I guess the third option is just leaving it with the apply to test, but yeah, thanks.
Right, yeah, good point. There is a third option. That's very helpful, thanks. Tony, you look like you're—
That was going to be my only comment, really, was that, yes, and option 3. So I think that's really important. I think I think some of the characteristics, I'm not sure I would phrase it as pros and cons of A or B, or but some of the characteristics here just are, you know, you applied to test. It's about as straightforward, I think, in application as these things can be, given the thousands of subsections of business practice manuals and tariffs. And so, you know, what do these either additions or the inverse process of extending it to a broader set and then excluding, do they create decisional clarity? Do those extra issues just are must-haves as it relates to the functioning of the EDM market, such that you just really can't have them separated from the joint authority? I mean, those are the kind of factors I think that I would like to hear, and then why, of course.
Rebecca, do you have any additional thoughts?
No, and I think I'm the one who said pros and cons. And I'm just looking at it from a practical standpoint. Anytime you add something in, what are you missing? Or if you're creating an exclusion list, what are you missing? So I probably mischaracterized it as pros and cons. It's just trying to capture specifics sometimes can be challenging, and you leave something out, and that's really what we're looking for stakeholders to. In the straw proposal, there's a tremendous amount of detail on this. What are we missing, and are you know, how can we think about this in a clear way so that it becomes a straightforward process going forward? I hope that helps, Elaine.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Therese, could I
Sure,
add just, you know, one of the nuances that's not on this slide is, of course, the EIM governing body, the EDM governing body, if that's what we move to, has advisory authority on everything, in some sense, around these spaces, right? They can pretty broadly weigh in. And so I think one of the pieces to keep in mind is where is it that you know, it might be just as constructive to have them providing an advisory opinion if the complexity of drawing bright lines, to Tony's point, if it just becomes incredibly complex and we're spending all our time in decisional disputes as opposed to dealing with the actual work in front of us. Does advisory authority help us at all with getting out of that trap so that we can focus on the actual work of deciding issues to build the market? So something to keep in mind. Thank you, Therese.
Sure, thanks for that addition. Actually, any other GRC members want to comment? I will say from my personal perspective, the issue of clarity in terms of supporting the decisional classification process has been a consideration that we've had even back to phase 2, really needing to set forward rules that would make that decisional classification process fairly straightforward has been important to us. And that's why when we requested specific proposals for rules or concepts, so we're not asking for you to say, this initiative that I know of today, right, should be under joint and this one shouldn't. We're actually looking for the rules or the concept that could live over time, recognizing that new and different market initiatives are going to come into play. So that's the kind of perspective that we have on this. Operator, are there other questions?
Yes, we do have some other questions. I'm going to go ahead and go to the next caller in the queue. Caller, your line is unmuted.
Hi there. This is Agnes Lute with Salt River Project. Can you hear me?
Yes, Agnes, go ahead.
Oh, hi. Good morning, everybody. Hi, Therese. Actually, my question I think you led up to it very well in your last statement there. I really appreciated what Rebecca was saying and going over in slide 9, and especially her reference to the GRC document, page 14. I haven't gotten that far yet. There's been a lot of meetings going on, but I really appreciated that. But one of the questions I have is, could the GRC comment on what scope of authority would apply to the wheeling initiative? That's certainly an initiative that we are keeping an eye on and monitoring and actively engaged in. So I was just wondering what scope of authority would apply to that. I think it's called the transmission service and market scheduling priorities now. Thank you.
Right. Operator, can you go to slide 9? And Agnes, just to clarify your question, you're saying under the applied to test, right? If we, or the applied to scope, how would that initiative fall under the applied to? Do I have your question correct?
Yes, that's correct, Therese. Thank you so much. Yeah, exactly how it was laid out here. Yep. Thank you.
Great. Tony?
I will be happy to opine with my personal opinion. And Agnes, we are shocked, absolutely shocked that this question could come up. So yeah, I think it's a really good question. And honestly, I think it's the rubber meets the road question because, and these are just my personal views. When you look at other issues that have been sensitive in the past, like market power mitigation, they seem to be squarely within joint authority. So there's, so I think, I don't want to say this is the only one left, but I mean, it is the primary one left. So I think there's also a nuance, and this will help describe my views, but they're just mine. So I think under joint authority, and I'm going to call it the wheel through initiative because I simply cannot commit to memory that formal initiative name. It's not joint. However, I personally think RSE transfers and EDAM transfers is joint, right? So they're closely akin. So you've got rules still being worked out in the EDAM discussions on the firmness of the transfers and how those all work and consequences during scarcity situations. In my view, those are clearly EDAM rules that would apply to an EDAM entity and our joint authority. However, the wheeling rules, which are not EDAM rules and are, I think, akin to some of the access rules under an open access tariff, I think would be not joint and likely advisory for the governing body. So those are my personal views, Agnes. I think that's likely how it breaks down on that hot button issue.
And so Agnes, that gets to my comment about comments, and operator, we can go to slide 10. So if that's an important, and as Tony's distinction, right? So if we're talking about the firmness of transactions that are covered under EDAM, those would be under joint authority. If we're talking about those outside of the EDAM market, they would not be under the supply to test. If you think they should, because they impact, if you can create the nexus for us, right, in terms of the rule or concept that should be added to, things that have XYZ impact or things that implicate, this aspect of the market design should be added to, would be helpful. That's the type of comment, shape of comment that would be helpful.
Great.
We'll
Thank you very much.
Follow up, Agnes. Okay.
No, that was really great. Thank you so much.
Sure. Operator, are there other questions?
Yes, there are. Let's go to the next caller in queue. Caller, your line is unmuted.
Good morning. This is Jeff Nelson from SCE. First, we want to thank everyone that's participated in the the GRC for the proposal, and we look forward to commenting on it. So thank you. Quick question. What about areas that are kind of gray or evolving? The thing that comes to my mind is virtual bidding, where EDAM is not anticipated to have virtual bidding outside of the ISO, at least initially. And so initially that would be sort of exclusively an ISO type item, but that might evolve over time. Have you guys thought about how evolving issues would be put into the different authority scopes? Thanks.
A little bit,
Thanks,
Jeffrey.
Jeff. Great,
Oh,
great
sorry.
question.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Sorry,
Tony.
Teresa, I mean to jump in there. A little bit. And so when we were looking at this, there were, I need to go back to my notes there were 2 or 3 examples, and virtual bidding was one of them, where, well, we don't really know what the EDAM rule is, right? And so is it going to have virtual bids? I think the concept is no, but if it did, how would it work? And I think if it did, then that would be a part of the market rules that applied. And it would fit, but right now it doesn't. So I wish I had my notes in front of me and easily accessible, but there were other examples where sort of outstanding, and then as you put it, future market rules could affect the delineation between what's joint and what's not joint. But I think one of the beauties of the applied to test is, if the terms and conditions that govern a virtual bidding apply to bids into the EDAM footprint, then seems like it's applied to. Again, I caveat, these are my personal views. But I think the applied to test is pretty functional and adaptable to the market changes.
Any other GRC comments on that? Jeff, it's a good question and something for us to consider. This is where advisory is always helpful. Advisory input is helpful, but maybe there is something about these potential future application issues that we could consider in comment.
I appreciate that. One other sort of question. So EDAM, I'm not quite sure how this transition happens or when it happens, or what you guys are thinking. So EDAM may ramp up. I'm optimistic it will. But it may have very few participants that join day one, right? There just may be 1 or 2 people that are ready to join day one, and then others are probably, going to wave their way in, sort of like we did with the EIM. But I suspect that'll happen. When would this new sort of joint authority sort of kick in? Would it require sort of critical mass of joining EDAM, or would it be as soon as the first EDAM person joins?
That's a great question. We do have a section in the paper that talks about when this would take effect as it's drafted. I think it is written that it would take effect with the EDAM market design, that the governance and the EDAM market design would go forward for approval at the same time and then be implemented. So there's no threshold identified for a number of participants in order for it to be put in place. But there is a section in the paper on that.
Okay, great. Thanks for the clarification.
Thanks, Jeff. Any other questions? And operators, there are other questions in the queue?
There's another hand raised. Caller, your line is unmuted.
Hello, can you guys hear me? This is Vijay Satyal with WRA.
Yes, we can. Thanks.
Thank you. Hello, Teresa, and thanks to all the GRC members for your work on this. We appreciate it. On this very slide, this is perfect, and I think I have an answer to my question, but I'll still confirm to Tony's point, and I think Therese, yours as well. The apply to test. Can I run an example with you all to see if you have deliberated this in your conversations? And this comes straight out of the EIM RIF conversations, where we were proposing a discussion item on August 29th to deal with stress conditions. And it's got consensus from all the RIF liaisons who feel that's a good panel topic for discussion. but there was a caution to not get into the RC matters or out of market actions. So is there any kind of debate or thought on that earlier in terms of a concept for exclusion that would keep out of market or reliability management matters out of consideration? Because when you enter the EDAM, you're entering a larger game footprint and a larger share of energy to be transacted, which is not the EIM anymore. So would that kind of example fit the exclusion for us to think about? I'm just curious. Thank you.
Tony, do you want to respond, or you want me to respond?
Sorry, sometimes, I'm not sure I have a ready response. Therese, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, I think that is the type of thing. So and my response isn't to say, right, yes or no, that should or shouldn't be excluded. But I think that's the type of approach to, if you think we should say, if you want to suggest an expanded scope of all real-time and day-ahead market rules with the exclusion of these things, right? And I think the way you categorize them are the right types of categories to talk about exclusion. Alternatively, right, just, if somebody wants to make a comment about the applied to test and additions, I think the way you've categorized it is the type of thing we would be looking for in terms of additions or exclusions.
Okay, thank you for that. And a quick follow-up on a related note is in the one of the visuals in the proposal, I've not fully read it yet, does show the market expert to have existing role as currently assigned to advise the EIMGB to be there. I am assuming that market expert advisory authority and role will be extended into the EDAM as well.
Yes, I think that is the assumption.
Great.
There is there is a section in the paper that does suggest that we are assuming the governing body expands its authority to include these responsibilities, and so that would, by natural extension, the independent market expert would be available to them for those issues as well.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thanks, Vijay. Operator, do we have other questions?
Yes, looks like we do have a hand raised. Caller, your line is unmuted.
Hi, this is Elaine Ginocchio again, and I'm back on slide 9. So I just might be missing a nuance here, but I was wondering if you could better explain the boundaries of advisory authority, or if there are, the way it's written. Well, anyway, is it sort of anything that, it is only advisory authority, but again, that's important. Is it sort of anything the governing body sort of thinks they should be providing advice on, or what is the limit that you mean by applies to the real-time or day-ahead market versus joint authority, which is more focused on participants, balancing authorities, et cetera?
Yeah, I think the distinction here is they would have advisory authority over all real-time or day-ahead market rules. So anything that's in the tariff related to the real-time or day-ahead market that they don't already have joint authority over, or that they don't already have decisional authority over. So if we think about the day-ahead and real-time market rules, the full set of rules, a significant portion of them will apply to EDAM market participants. For that subset that does not apply directly to EDAM market participants, they would have advisory authority over.
Okay, can you give an example of something that would fall outside of that?
I would need my paper in front of me. Tony, do you have your paper in front of you, or Rebecca? It is in the document on page 14. We give an example of those things that are under the apply to, that would obviously be under the apply to, and then there's a footnote of the things that would logically not be under the apply to. I just don't have my paper up. I apologize.
That's good enough. Thanks, Therese. I can find it in there.
Operator, are there other questions?
Yes, we do have another hand raised. Caller, your line is unmuted.
Hi, this is Omaya Ahmad with APS. I just have a quick question. Will the GRC be making a public statement or recommendation to the California Legislature that legislative changes need to be happening to achieve true broader market regionalization?
Thanks, Maya. No, that is not part of our scope. In the introduction section of the document, we have recognized the stakeholder comments that have been made to us on that, but have kind of recognized our scope specifically related to the EDAM market. And this is where that one principle that I talked about that we've added is we're trying to do our work in a way that does not get in the way or is supportive of other efforts. So that's, we won't make a statement like that because it's not within our scope.
All right, thank you.
Operator, are there other questions?
I'm not showing any other hands raised at this moment.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for those questions. We're going to continue moving through the straw proposal. The next section is about the size and composition of the governing body, and Eric Eisenman is going to present on that. And if you can move to the next slide for him, that would be great.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks, Therese. So the information I'm going to be providing is on page 21 of the straw proposal. So first, as we've already articulated, the Governance Review Committee is recommending that the governing body's role be expanded to include joint decision-making authority over EDAM, just as it has now for the energy imbalance market. So I think everyone knows that there is a nominating committee that identifies candidates for the governing body, interviews them, and makes a recommendation to the governing body. Now, we've had a number of instances where a governing body member whose term is expiring was interested in being renominated. And usually, in fact, I think always that has just moved forward. And if a governing body member wanted to remain on the governing body for another 3-year term, that happened. So what we're recommending here is for the current members of the governing body, if they want to continue on the governing body, want to be renominated for another 3-year term, and EDAM is in place, that the nominating committee evaluate, talk to the member about whether they have the qualifications to continue serving given the additional responsibility. So that's a little bit of a nuance, just to kind of confirm that they have the skills necessary to take on EDAM. Next, we'd like some comments and feedback on whether the current compensation for all the governing body members is sufficient or needs to be increased or changed in some other manner. In the paper, I believe there is a link to where there's information about what the compensation is. And basically the logic here to change the compensation is you need appropriate compensation to attract the best candidates for the governing body. So we would appreciate some comment and feedback on that. And then last, the governing body, when it was formed with 5 members. It still has 5 members. There are now a lot of states involved, a lot more than we originally had. And if we go to EDAM, the governing body members are going to have a lot more responsibility. So what we'd like feedback on and comments on is whether it would be appropriate to increase the size of the governing body members from 5 to 7. Now, the logic being a lot more states and more work to do, more responsibilities. The logic against it, just keeping it at 5, is the governing body is well functioning, and so why change something that doesn't really need fixing. So we would appreciate feedback on if EDAM, if and when EDAM happens, whether the right size of the governing body remains at 5 or should be increased to 7. So that's what I have for you today. Any questions?
Operator, if you want to open the line for questions, that'd be great.
See, John would like to say something.
Yeah, Therese, before we get to the public comment, can I just a couple comments? And Eric, good job going through that. Just a couple of points on the appointing existing members when our term expires. Even today, we go through an interview process. And what this recommendation would be, just like Eric explained, would be that the nominating committee now needs to consider the further expansion of duties. And does it fit the profile? So it's really just doing what we're doing today, but adding the EDAM as a responsibility that the nominating committee looks at. And then finally, the comment on whether it's 5 or 7, just to be very clear, we as a governing body member, we don't represent a sector, a state, a region, or anything else. We represent the market as a whole. So the comments that come in would need to be focused on the function of the governing body, not the governing body representing specific states and or regions. But I think Eric did a good job of explaining that. I just wanted to add a little bit. Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, John. Operator, are there any questions in the queue?
Not at the moment, but if you'd like to ask a question, you can use the raise hand icon in Zoom in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen, or if you are audio only, you can dial #2 on your telephone keypad.
Okay, great. Let's go ahead and transition to the next section where we will talk about stakeholder engagement. And Pam Sporbor from PGE is going to talk about that. You can go to the next slide for her.
Thank you, Therese. So in the first set of recommendations from the Governance Review Committee, several changes were proposed with regards to stakeholder engagement, specifically changes to the RIF's sector liaison composition and an expansion to the RIF's scope of authority. The GRC has continued to review the role of stakeholders in the overall governance process, and we reviewed several different models used in other ISO markets, including SPP, MISO, and PJM, to identify if a different approach to stakeholders' decision-making or an expanded role within the governance structure would be appropriate for the EDAM. After reviewing the pros and cons of these different models, the GRC does not propose any specific changes to adopt any of these more structured voting models, because the current model that CAISO has is inclusive and provides really equal access for all stakeholders. So the GRC does not at this time propose any recommended changes to the overall decision-making process concerning stakeholder engagement. However, we do recommend that the CAISO expand the use of the working groups, which were very successful with the EDAM straw proposal, or in getting us to the EDAM straw proposal, with the goal of really enhancing the role of stakeholders in both the development and the consideration of options for market expansion. While we recognize that working groups require additional commitment of staff time and engagement from stakeholders, we believe that especially for really critical and high impact initiatives, this model can enhance the role of stakeholders in driving market design changes that really brings more of that stakeholder perspective into the scoping and the initial proposal to for market design change. Next slide. This graphic was used in our last presentation and attempts to capture the general participation models that exist in organized markets across the country. The box in the upper left-hand side reflects the status quo of the CAISO stakeholder process, specifically an engagement process that is open to all stakeholders and decisions are made by the board and the governing body. We continue to believe that this is the model that where stakeholders have common access to the process and continues to be the appropriate model for the EDAM. Next slide. So the GRC has continued to evaluate the role of the Regional Issues Forum as part of the overall governance process. And as a reminder, the last round of recommendations proposed some pretty detailed changes to the scope of the RIF. The implementation of those changes is underway. And we continue to believe that the RIF is the appropriate venue to implement those recommendations and to really give the Regional Issues Forum the time to adapt and really lean into the full expanded scope of their authority. However, our proposal does include 2 additional recommendations for stakeholder engagement. Specifically, we are recommending that at the beginning of CAISO's process for prioritizing discretionary initiatives in the policy roadmap, that the Regional Issues Forum host a roundtable discussion around these priorities. This would give the sector liaisons and other representatives from the sector an opportunity to comment or expand upon stakeholder initiatives that they support. And we would encourage the board and governing body members to be in attendance to really hear this dialogue around the drivers behind different stakeholder initiatives and to get a dialogue going about the prioritization process and to really provide more transparency and engagement in the way that initiatives are taken up by the process. Clearly, there are some restrictions around what the CAISO can take on in terms of staff time and scope, and this process would have to recognize those limitations as well as the non-discretionary initiatives that reflect a FERC compliance obligation or other compliance requirements. So that's our first major recommendation. Secondly, the GRC recommends that the current RIF public interest and consumer advocate group sector is currently composed of 1 liaison from each side of the sector. We're proposing that each group of liaisons actually does the voting to elect its own liaison. So currently the voting is across all members of the sector. So a member of a public interest organization votes on the consumer advocate liaison and vice versa. We propose to have voting be unique to the sector for which that liaison will represent. And so that it still remains one sector, but that the voting for each liaison is conducted independently. And the GRC believes that this recommendation enables consistency between the Regional Issues Forum and the nominating committee, while enabling the additional independence for selecting liaisons from these 2 separate groups that comprise this sector. Next slide.
I think that's the end of the stakeholder engagement section. And so we'll just stop there and see if there are any questions. Operator, if you want to give the instructions.
Well, once again, if you'd like to ask a question, you can use the raise hand icon in the toolbar, or if you are audio only, dial #2 on your telephone keypad. I'm not showing any questions at this time.
Okay, great.
Thanks,
Pam.
Sorry, one hand just raised. Caller, your line is unmuted.
Hello, this is Vijay with Vijay Satyal, WRA. Hi, Pam. Thank you for that update. If we can go back to, as you may understand, naturally, I may have a RIF question. On slide 17, thank you, operator. The first bullet, I just want to understand the nuance to this since I'm literal in interpretation here. I think, are is the GRC recognizing the current authority to the RIF in terms of providing advisory opinions, or I'm just trying to better understand the first line. I think you may be aware that the RIF liaisons have sent some questions to CalISO Legal to ask for clarity on some formal ways we may give feedback on any proposals or anything in the EIM world to the appropriate staff and governing body in future. But I just want to better understand what authority are we referring to with the advisory opinions as of now, or what you're proposing through the proposal?
Vijay, I think what this is trying to encapsulate is that in the last round of recommendations, the GRC significantly expanded the scope of the Regional Issues Forum,
Right.
and changed a lot of the structure. And that this really is intending to provide the Regional Issues Forum the opportunity to grow into that without imposing additional obligations of expanded scope or changes. That we want to give the RIF the time to evolve into the current authority that was the current new authority that was provided I think about 18 months ago.
Right.
And
Yeah.
and that's not a really long time for really the RIF to have fully adapted or taken advantage of this authority, and that there continues to be evolving opportunities. You mentioned your inquiries to the ISO legal about how to implement this, and we don't want to disrupt that by changing direction or requiring even more expanded scope at this time. I think this is certainly an opportunity to get feedback, and if there are areas where you've seen any need to have additional authority, we'd appreciate that feedback. But I think the intent here is to let you run with what you currently have, and to ensure that the RIF can continue to evolve appropriately.
Thank you so much for that. That's great. And my only other question, if I may quickly ask, is thank you for that, Pam. That confirms what I thought and brings me more comfort. On the second bullet, please. We've had some informal conversations with Cal ISO staff to better understand how we could, part of the visibility of the RIF, to have more attendance of the governing body members. I assume or presume that the GRC has debated or discussed the rules around not quorum, but what is the rules for governing body members, if they can all be in attendance or not. So I don't know if the proposal gives more clarity on what you are suggesting in terms of attendance, but as a comment, I really like the second bullet, but I just want to know if you're tackling some of the procedural rules of participation of governing body members, or you are not, or you're asking feedback on that.
Pam, I'm happy to start that.
Yeah, you want to take that one?
John Prescott, if you want to step in, or even Bert, if you want to step in. We did have that conversation because we recognize that's been an issue in the past, and I think we do not address it in the paper, but we think that can be addressed by properly noticing the meeting, that they can be in attendance, so that there is procedural ways to provide for their attendance. And I'll let Member Prescott or Bert correct me if I've stated that inaccurately.
Yeah, this is John. That's how I read it too. You know, we're subject to the open meeting rules, and as long as it's a noticed meeting for the governing body, then we can attend the forum.
Thank you. Thank you, Member Prescott, and thank you, Therese, and thank you, Pam. Thank you.
Thanks, Vijay. I did expect that you would have questions on this slide.
Well, I just have to cover the back of my peer liaisons so that we don't miss anything. Thank you.
Great. Operator, are there any other questions?
We do have another caller in queue. Caller, your line is unmuted.
Great, thank you. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Awesome. Okay, and thanks for that. I do have a question on the third one. And this is something that, because I appreciate the way that Pam was talking, you were talking through this, and I caught some of your language as referring to that this sector of the public interest and consumer advocate groups has two separate groups that comprise this one sector. So first my question, and then I have a follow-up, I believe, but my first question is, that assumption, to me that sounds like an assumption that the GRC is making, that this sector has two subsectors. I'm not super well versed in all of the documentation, so I was wondering if you could clarify if that is specified in any of the governance documents, or if that's more of like a working practice and assumption that this is kind of formalizing. Does that make sense?
Kathleen, that's a great question. So when the Regional Issues Forum was first stood up, and I think, you know, I think the nuance here is that many sectors feel that they have, you know, structural differences or significant differences between the sectors. For example, the EIM entity sector has both investor-owned utilities and public power entities. And I think those groups historically really view themselves differently, but within the sector, we have, or the sector has, you know, been able to really kind of just within the sector agree that one liaison would be from an investor-owned utility and one liaison would be from public power. In the public interest and consumer advocate sector, the original liaison makeup was specific that one representative would be from a public interest organization, really generally, not universally, but generally an organization that has a .org email address, and that one liaison would be from a consumer advocate. Again, not universally, but generally a .gov email address, that it's a state agency or an agency that is specifically recognized by the state as a consumer advocate. As this group has grown and as the RIF has evolved, the voting for liaisons has been more challenging within the sector than in some of the other sectors. And so the request from the sector is that that the voting really be split between these two different components of the subsector. I think there's maybe a perception or reality within the sector that there's too much of a divergence between some of the components or the stakeholders that comprise the sector, where voting would be more appropriate to be specifically split so that organizations that identify as public interest organizations are just voting for their liaison, and organizations that are identifying as a consumer advocate are just voting for their liaison. So that nomination structure, that voting structure is more divided than in the other sectors.
No, thank you. That's all really helpful context. And I appreciate your example of the EIM sector as well, because that's helpful and gets at where, you know, kind of where I'm coming from. And for those who don't know, I'm one of the IPP and marketer sector liaisons. And I think that is how it shook out for our sector, is that it wasn't, I don't know that we intended to have one liaison rep from an IPP and one liaison from a marketer side, but it shook out that way. And we coordinate across the sector to come to kind of conversations across both IPPs and marketers. And so part of what when I read through this, you know, recommendation, was thinking through it is there some expectation that's broader and bigger than your specific recommendation, that within the sectors that there should be this kind of distinction when we have two different like subgroups, and we should be thinking about how to handle that in a more formal way. And I was curious if you had any thoughts on that.
I want to be very careful here. I think then that in the other sectors, there's a greater experience of just coordination across the different components of the sector, and that these kinds of ability to work it out within the sector it's been a lot easier. I think you noted that it wasn't really intentional, but that it worked it out for you and a marketer to share the sector, and that other sectors feel that it's easier to just work it out. The public interest and consumer advocate sector is feeling more that they want more formality here, and it's a specific request of the sector that we did not necessarily want to extend to other sectors. So this is, I think, a sector-based request rather than that is identifying something that is just specific and to the sector, whereas the other sectors seem to be happy or there haven't been the same kind of requests bubbling out of the other sectors. The other sectors are satisfied with their ability to have the flexibility within their sector to share responsibilities and to carry the nominations forward collaboratively.
That's really helpful, Pam. My last question for the GRC is, no, I'm remembering that the last iteration of governance changes, we added some new sectors and kind of did some refinement on that. What's the threshold that you guys are thinking of when you're trying to decide if a sector perhaps needs to be like separated or added to address these issues as well? I realize that your recommendation isn't proposing that, and I'm just trying to understand kind of what that threshold bar logic is, and that would be really helpful.
Therese, would you speak to the reorganization of the sectors previously?
Sure. When we did the reorganization of the sectors previously, we actually had a neighboring balancing authority area sector that it wasn't relevant anymore. So part of it was just evaluating it for relevancies. Were the sectors, did we feel like they adequately represented the stakeholders that were engaged? And we had a conversation about looking at the sectors this time and felt like they do represent the key stakeholders to the EDAM market, but they can be evaluated over time. And that's really kind of the threshold question is, are the liaisons representative of the stakeholders of the market in place?
Thanks, Therese.
Sure.
Is the GRC, and this is something that I don't necessarily will provide feedback in written comments on this, but part of why I'm asking, well, the reason I'm asking these kinds of questions is I am trying to assess whether or not some of the feedback to give is this recommendation more of the result of perhaps this sector isn't, maybe there is a sector that maybe they should be separate sectors, and then there would be two liaisons, which would expand the representation and of these two separate groups. I don't know what that threshold is yet for that to be the appropriate step, and so I'm just struggling through that, if that's what this recommendation is really indicating.
Yeah, and you said something there. So one of the other things that we look at relative to the number of liaisons is the stakeholders that are being represented, right? So shouldn't assume, for instance, if they're separated into two sectors that they then get two liaisons. It's not actually true that every sector gets two liaisons. For instance, the Federal Power Marketing Agency just has one liaison. So I think really
the power marketing sector isn't a sector, it is an additional liaison from. It's a very nuanced.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you.
So they aren't
Right.
actually a sector. It is essentially public power gets an additional, or the EIM entities get an additional representative for the PMAs.
Yeah. Thanks, Sam. It's a really good clarification. So I think, Kathleen, I think the recommendation here, it came from the participants in this sector based on their experience and a way to create for better representation within their sector.
That's really helpful. One of the impacts that I could see of kind of starting this precedent of having them be separate voting is if the RIF were ever to take on kind of a voting decision-making process, it could introduce some lack of clarity on whether that sector represents, let's say, 1 vote, or if it represents 2 votes. And that's just something I'd ask the GRC to kind of think about potential unintended consequences of kind of setting up a new policy here.
Kathleen, I think that was a component of our recommendation here. And the alternative would have been to split this sector into 2 separate sectors with 1 representative from a public interest org and 1 representative from a consumer advocate. But I think there are parallels here with the nominating committee sectors, and that to me was, and I'm speaking for myself, and I know there's a diversity of opinions in the stakeholder community on this. So that this was a good compromise that kept the sector whole and minimized some of the impacts or potential impacts or precedent when considering the nominating committee or other potential voting opportunities here. I also think that, again, this is a request that came out of this sector, and that because the RIF is self-selected liaisons and the sectors are really independently organized, that sectors have the opportunity to develop some of their own internal processes, that the nominating process for each sector has more flexibility, and that this is a request that flexibility was not really working for this sector. So I think the tacit approach that the EIM entities take, where we have 1 public power and 1 IOU liaison, that's what's working for us. We have that approach and process and opportunity to self-organize in the way that works for us. I think within the RIF guidelines, your sector has a similar opportunity to self-organize in a way that works for you, but that this is a request from this sector that was saying that kind of flexibility was not working for them. And so this was an attempt to really give them a structure that would be more reflective of their needs while maintaining that kind of flexibility for the other sectors where flexibility was valued to enable that sector to have the right approach that works for them.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to need to move us because we're going to run out of time, actually, which is not something that has happened. Kathleen, thank you for the questions. We're happy to follow up, and we're happy to get your comments. So you've actually added in some considerations of things for us to think about in this process. So we really appreciate that. Operator, I just want to check before we go to the next section. Was there anybody else in queue?
Yes, there was. Caller, your line is unmuted.
Therese, hello, this is Vijay with WRA, and I'll be quick on this one. I just want to clarify to the GRC on the call that I'm aware of this proposal being made. Just want to clarify from the perspective of the PIO subsector. I'm using a new name now. We want to work harmoniously with the consumer advocate groups, and the nomination request that has come. Just want to clarify that this is not a PIO informed or collected, agreed upon. This must be a direct request from the consumer advocate sector, a subsector, and I recognize it. I do want to comment that we will work in our comments, or I personally will, on behalf of WRA and PIO entity, is the unintended consequence. If you will create any specific guidance or future changes for voting, that the unintended consequence that Kathleen brought up is exactly what we have to be mindful of if we do this separation, for the very reason that was noted in the justification of this request is the divergence of thinking. If there is divergence of thinking, and then if there be voting ever to be done, then we could have a conflict, and then how would we resolve it? I just want to highlight that unintended consequence as we will work through it in our comments as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Vijay. Thanks. We do look forward to your comments on this. All the comments are really helpful. So we're going to transition to the last section. Rob Taylor's going to cover this, and if we can go forward 2 slides, that would be terrific. Great. Rob.
Great, thanks, Therese. So I'll walk through this. I recognize I'm the last speaker between you and Therese, giving you sort of the next steps. So I'll try to do this quickly, but we are really interested in your comments. So please, if you don't get a chance to ask a question or raise a comment today, please file some written comments with us or reach out to any member of the GRC. So one of the concerns that we heard was a concern about equal treatment of entities outside of the CAISO area by the governing body, by the CAISO. And that concern arises in part out of the statutory construction, but also how the CAISO is structured as a public benefits corporation within California. And while the CAISO Legal has put together a good document explaining that those neither the statute nor the structure of the entity requires the CAISO favor one stakeholder group or one set of entities over another, it's still a concern that's been raised. So we are making some recommendations to see how can we address that while staying within the current statutory framework, as Therese mentioned earlier. And the recommendation essentially is we think we can go further in the governance documents for the CAISO to make it clear that the governing body has to recognize the interest of all stakeholders and to be very specific about that. And I'll turn you to the slide because there's some specific language that we really want your feedback on. So one, positively state that the governance document, the purpose, public benefit purpose extends to all stakeholders, and to make sure that we can connect that to the corporate purpose for the entity. So that's one sort of broad change, but specifically also make it clear that as a means of fulfilling its corporate purpose, that the CAISO has to consider the interest of all stakeholders, and that is consistent with its obligation as a nonprofit public benefit corporation under its organizing principles. So those are the recommendations that we're making. We think, we would really love to get your feedback on those as to whether or not you think those are sufficient or helpful. Or if there's more that we could do here, again, while staying within the current statutory framework. So I'm happy to answer questions. It looks like there's a couple there. So I'll turn it back over to the operator to clear the questions.
All right, we'll go to the first caller in queue. Caller, your line is unmuted.
Hi, this is Leah Fisher with Public Generating Pool. Can you hear me?
Yes.
And I apologize, I don't actually have a specific question on this section. I just had some more general remarks I wanted to offer if the time is okay. And I promise, I know we're running low on time, I will keep them to probably just about 90 seconds here, if it's okay to proceed forward now.
Go ahead, Leah. Look forward to hearing from you.
Okay, great. Well, generally, I just want to say I really continue to be impressed with the work of the GRC, in particular in really crafting a proposal that balances stakeholder input and particularly drives, I think, at establishing a strong foundation for EDAM and for broader regionalization. In our most recent comments, we did support the joint authority model for EDAM, and that's for many of the reasons that the GRC has articulated in its proposal and today. And in discussing joint authority, the proposal includes a statement that really resonated with me. It notes that the EDAM and EIM markets that are they're co-optimized across the entire regional footprint, and they're not separate markets for California and other participating states, and that as regional markets expand, it may be more likely there are some tariff rules that do not actually apply to EIM and EDAM market participants, but may substantially nonetheless affect their operations. I think these are really keen observations in the proposal and really point toward expanding joint authority beyond the apply to test. So we are very interested in further exploring the option the GRC put forward to extend joint authority to all real-time and day-ahead market rules, but then create that defined set of exceptions or exclusions for topics that would remain subject to the board's sole approval. So really appreciate the GRC putting forth some options to consider expanding joint authority, and we look forward to commenting and engaging on those. And now shifting gears just for a quick moment, I really just want to take another few seconds to comment on process. I think the GRC has really set the bar in terms of how they do the work they are doing. In addition to holding these public meetings, I think the GRC has really gone above and beyond. They've done extensive direct outreach to stakeholders throughout this process to ensure they're getting as much feedback as they can. And also, and I think this is so incredibly helpful, in the written proposal, the GRC describes at length all of its deliberations and considerations and coming up with its recommendations. This is super valuable as a stakeholder as we're trying to understand why a particular element is or isn't included in a proposal. So I just really want to reiterate how helpful that is, and for the GRC to just keep doing that. And lastly, I think the summary provided at the end of the proposal that captures the highlights of the proposal in short form, again, is super helpful as a busy stakeholder participating in lots of meetings and reviewing many proposals. Including a summary like this really helps our ability to engage. So I just want to acknowledge that you're doing great work, and we really look forward to continue to engage on the governance proposal elements going forward. So again, just want to give some kudos on process, because I think sometimes that gets overlooked. Thanks.
Thanks, Leah. We appreciate those comments. Looks like we have a couple of other questions.
Yep, we'll go to the next person in queue. Caller, your line is unmuted.
Hi, yeah, this is Elaine Ginocchio with a specific question. Before, I'd like to agree a lot with what Leah just said, especially about process. And the way you've made it much easier for stakeholders with limited resources and limited time, which is probably all of us at this point, to engage in this process and the extra steps you take to help us understand things. But my specific question is that do you need to make a tariff change to make changes in the CAISO bylaws?
I don't think so. Well, let me turn that over to Bert to respond to.
Yeah, the answer to that is we do not. The bylaws are not part of the tariff. They're independent of the tariff.
Thank you.
Great. And it looks like there's still one more question. Operator.
Yep, we'll go to that caller. Caller, your line is unmuted.
Hey, this is Michelle Keto from the CPC. I just wanted to address our issues. I think in our comments we had indicated that we have that we support the joint model, and we support the apply to as in EIM entities. However, we did express some serious concerns about expanding the joint authority to all day ahead and real-time issues. And in particular, I think the issue is that many things significantly affect other entities, but some of those are well outside the scope of joint authority. For example, I would note CAISO's treatment of its own transmission system would arguably stay within the CAISO, but one could argue that it significantly affects other folks. So I would just reiterate our position that we support the current framing of the joint authority, and we don't support the expansion of it at this point in time. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you,
Great,
Michelle.
thanks, Michelle. I'm sorry, Rob.
Oh no, I was just going to say this. So the next couple of slides, or the next few slides here, are really just a summary of the proposal that we've already walked through. So we won't cover those, but they're there for your reference as you go forward if you need a quick, easy summary. And then I'm going to turn it back over to Therese to talk about next steps.
Great, thanks, Rob. So this is just in the PowerPoint, you have the summary that was referenced. And then go back to slide 23. These are the next steps. Thanks for the little bit of extra time. I know we're running long. So like I mentioned, we're looking forward to your comments between now and August 15th. Really appreciated hearing some of the comments already here today. We're looking forward to those substantive comments coming in. I want to reiterate again, reach out to any one of us at any point if you want a briefing, if you just want to talk, if you just want to share your thoughts. The GRC members bring all of that into the conversation. We are planning to have a public meeting to discuss stakeholder comments in late August, I believe. We've settled on August 29th, but we'll formally notice that when as soon as we can, and then we will work to refine and develop a revised straw proposal, which we will issue in late October. Still on track to have a final proposal in December to bring to the joint boards with the EDAM market design proposal. Just a reminder, our proposal goes forward with the EDAM market design proposal, so they stay in tandem. Even if one ends up ahead of the other, we will hold whichever one to get them both forward together. There are, the next slide is just references to any additional information that you might need or want, which is also on the CAISO webpage, in particular on the initiative webpage, has all of this information. I'm happy to stay, but we're here, operator. If there are any questions, any last questions that anybody has for us, take the opportunity to take those questions and comments.
All right, we do have a caller in queue. Caller, your line is unmuted.
This is Vijay Satyal, WRA, Therese, and the GRC members. Many thanks and congratulations on this work. This is thoughtful and helpful. On behalf of the RIF, I just want to extend an invitation to anybody from the GRC to be able to either provide a short update or speak to the RIF sections, especially on the August 29th RIF meeting. We are given 45 minutes on the agenda, so I just want to make that public formal request or of invitation known to you all. And thank you.
Terrific. Thanks, Vijay. Any other comments in queue?
I'm not showing any at this time.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning. Thanks for taking the time to read the proposal, and we look forward to your comments. Appreciate your input. With that, the meeting is adjourned.
That concludes today's conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.